Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. The metallic tang of dried blood always clung to the back of Nara's throat, a permanent reminder of her station within the Ironfang battle hall. She knelt on the cold stone, her knuckles white as she gripped a coarse burlap rag to scrub the crimson stains left by the morning's victory celebration. Above her, the rafters groaned under the weight of boisterous laughter and the heavy thud of ale mugs hitting scarred oak tables. The warriors didn't see her. To them, she was merely a shadow that moved beneath the light, a biological tool designed to erase the mess of their violence. Her lungs burned with the sharp scent of lye and pine resin used to mask the copper odor of war. Every repetitive motion sent a dull ache through her spine, yet she kept her head bowed because looking up invited a boot to the ribs or a stinging insult. Safety was a narrow corridor she navigated by shrinking her presence until she was almost non-existent. Having spent years perfecting this art of invisibility, Nara knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which shadows offered the deepest sanctuary. The pack viewed her as a void, a vessel for their chores, and she had long ago accepted this assessment as her ultimate truth. She survived by being a ghost within her own home. If she didn't exist in their eyes, they couldn't break what remained of her spirit. Why did the strongest wolves always require the most cleaning? The question drifted through her mind like smoke, unanchored and dangerous. She watched a drop of her own sweat hit the floor, mixing with the fading red of a fallen enemy's life force. Her worth was tied to the cleanliness of these stones. If the hall shone, she was allowed to eat the scraps. If a single smudge remained, the hunger would return to gnaw at her stomach. Despite the noise of the celebration, a sudden, unnatural hush rippled through the room, making the hair on Nara's neck stand upright. The Alpha's voice cut through the air, sharp as a whetted blade, discussing the winter rations and the upcoming patrols. She froze, her rag hovering over a stubborn patch of grit. They were talking about efficiency. They were talking about dead weight. A knot of cold dread formed in her chest because she knew her name never appeared on the lists of protected assets. She was the Cleaner Omega, a title that felt more like a sentence than a role. As the high-ranking wolves argued over the cost of silver-tipped spears, Nara felt a strange, rhythmic thrumming deep beneath the soles of her feet. It was a vibration the others seemed to ignore, preoccupied by their greed and pride. Was the earth itself mourning her presence? She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the way her hands trembled against the wet floor. The celebration continued, but the air had turned brittle, signaling a shift that Nara felt in her very marrow. She was a ghost, yes, but even ghosts can feel the coming of a storm. Chapter 2. The Decree of the Void. Beyond the heavy iron-bound doors of the Great Hall, the winter wind howled like a wounded beast. Yet the chill inside the room felt far more lethal. Nara remained pressed against the shadows of a stone pillar, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The pack elders had gathered in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the hearth fire. Their eyes were hard, reflecting a pragmatism that left no room for mercy or sentiment. One elder, a man with skin like cracked parchment, gestured toward the corner where Nara stood. He didn't use her name. He didn't acknowledge her humanity. Instead, he uttered 5 words that shattered her world. "Get the Cleaner Omega out." The sentence hung in the air, a finality that tasted like ash and swallowed the warmth of the room. Because they viewed her as a drain on their dwindling resources, the decision required no further debate. Nara felt a hot prickle of tears behind her eyelids, but she refused to let them fall. To cry was to show a weakness they would only exploit further. She practiced her indifference like a shield, hardening her expression into a mask of stone even as her soul felt like it was being flayed alive. Did they not remember the nights she spent stitching their wounds in silence? Did they forget the way she scrubbed the filth of their failures from the communal floors? It didn't matter. In the brutal mathematics of the Ironfang Pack, she was a remainder that needed to be subtracted. She agreed with them, a treacherous voice whispered in her mind, and that was the deepest betrayal of all. She had been conditioned to believe she was replaceable, and now the prophecy was fulfilling itself. Suddenly, the ground groaned with a low, guttural intensity that caused the ale in the cups to ripple. The elders paused, glancing toward the darkened windows with a flicker of uncertainty. The tremor was brief but profound, a geological protest that coincided perfectly with the approval of her exile. Nara felt a strange connection to that shuddering earth, as if the land itself recognized the injustice being carved into her fate. "The borders are weakening," the Alpha muttered, his brow furrowing as he ignored the shivering girl in the corner. He blamed the shifting tectonic plates or the encroaching rival packs, never suspecting that the girl they were casting out held the very threads of their stability. Nara took a shaky breath, her fingers digging into the fabric of her tattered tunic. She was being discarded like a broken tool, sent into the wilderness where the rogues and the cold would finish what the pack started. As she turned to leave the hall for the last time, a sharp crack echoed from the foundation stones. It was a small sound, but it carried the weight of a crumbling empire. Chapter 3. The fragile frontier night had draped the forest in a suffocating velvet blackness by the time Nara reached the outer perimeter of the Ironfang territory. She carried nothing but a small satchel and the crushing weight of her own insignificance. The air here felt different, thinner, colder, and charged with an electricity that made her skin crawl. Every step away from the pack house was a step toward a terrifying freedom she had never requested. She stopped at the invisible line where the scent of her kin faded into the wild, untamed musk of the deep woods. A profound sense of relief washed over her, followed immediately by a wave of sharp, agonizing grief. She was finally free from the scrubbing brushes and the insults, but she was also alone in a world that devoured the solitary. Since she had no destination, she allowed her feet to lead her toward the mountain passes where the trees grew thick and gnarled. Behind her, the Ironfang borders seemed to waver in the moonlight, the protective shimmer of the pack's collective will flickering like a dying candle. Nara didn't know that her departure had left a hole in their psychic defense. She only knew that the silence of the woods felt more honest than the noise of the hall. The wind whispered through the pine needles, a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to call her name. She was no longer a servant, but she wasn't yet a person. She was a ghost wandering between worlds, waiting for the cold to claim her, or the moon to guide her. How long can a heart beat when it has no home to anchor it? Meanwhile, miles away in the valley below, the first consequence of her exile manifested with bloody precision. An elite squad of Ironfang warriors, men who had mocked Nara only hours before, suddenly found their coordination shattered. They stumbled in the dark, their heightened senses dulled by a sudden, inexplicable fog of confusion. Without Nara's stabilizing presence acting as a silent anchor for the pack's chaotic energy, they were vulnerable. A group of scavengers, usually no match for trained soldiers, descended upon them with a ferocity that turned the snow red. Nara paused on a high ridge, looking back toward the flickering lights of her former home. A single, mournful howl echoed through the canyon, a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. She didn't realize it was the sound of her past burning down. She simply tightened the strap of her bag and disappeared into the shadows of the ancient trees.
Chapter 4. The Predator's Piece. The scent of pine needles and damp earth usually signaled a successful hunt, but for Alpha Kael, it only masked the metallic tang of his own impending madness. He moved through the mist-shrouded border of the Nightfall Dominion like a storm looking for a place to break, his lungs burning with a fire no winter air could extinguish. His wolf was a jagged thing, a collection of teeth and fury that clawed at the underside of his skin, demanding a violence he could no longer justify. Every step through the underbrush felt like treading on broken glass because the ancestral curse of his bloodline was finally catching up to him. He was a king without a tether, a leader whose very presence was beginning to vibrate with a frequency that shattered the composure of his subordinates. They feared his strength, yes, but lately, they feared his silence even more. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying a fragrance that shouldn't have existed in this desolate, frozen stretch of the frontier. It was the smell of ozone before a rainstorm, mixed with the faint, sweet aroma of wild honey and sun-warmed stone. Kael froze, his hand tightening on the hilt of a hunting knife he didn't need. His beast, usually a screaming tempest of rage, went abruptly, unnervingly still. It wasn't a submissive quiet, but a profound, resonant recognition that made his heart stutter in his chest. A girl stood in a small clearing less than 20 paces away, her tattered clothes a stark contrast to the ethereal glow of the moonlight on her pale skin. She looked like a ghost carved from the fog, small and fragile enough that a single blow from his paw would snap her in two. "Who are you?" Kael's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sounded foreign even to his own ears. He watched her flinch, her shoulders hunching in a practiced motion of someone who expected a strike. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with a terrifying mixture of shame and terror, locked onto his, and the world simply stopped spinning. The mate bond didn't just snap into place. It roared through his veins like a flash flood, dousing the fires of his insanity in a single cooling wave. For the first time in 3 years, the screaming in his head ceased. He stood there, a predator suddenly robbed of his instinct to kill, staring at an Omega who looked like she wanted to vanish into the dirt. Why did the universe provide a cure that looked so much like a victim? Because he was an alpha of the Nightfall, he should have claimed her there, but the raw brokenness in her gaze made him hesitate. He turned his back on the miracle, walking away into the darkness while his soul screamed at the abandonment. Chapter 5. The Cost of a Ghost. News of the Ironfang Pack's disaster traveled faster than a forest fire, reaching Kael's ears before the morning sun could pierce the canopy. He sat in his war room, the stone walls sweating with the humidity of a dozen agitated alphas, yet his own mind remained unnervingly clear. The report was catastrophic. 3 border patrols slaughtered, their tactical coordination vanishing as if they had forgotten how to hunt in a pack. Reports from the survivors spoke of a hollowing out of their spirit, a sudden void where their collective strength used to reside. Kael listened to the bickering of his council, his fingers tracing the grain of the obsidian table. He knew exactly when the Ironfang began to bleed out. It was the moment they threw away the girl with the scent of ozone and honey. The Ironfang Council is blaming a curse. His beta, a scarred warrior named Vance, spat as he tossed a scroll onto the table. They claim a spy sabotaged their spiritual anchors, and they've put a bounty on a runaway Omega. Kael felt a cold, predatory anger coil in his gut, a protective instinct he had no right to feel for a stranger. They were hunting her because they were too arrogant to admit that their entire foundation rested on the shoulders of the girl they called a cleaner. Nara, the name had whispered itself into his mind during the night, wasn't a saboteur. She was the heartbeat they had ripped out of their own chest. He looked at his shaking hands, realizing they were steady for the first time in months. His madness hadn't returned, even after he left her. The mere fact that she existed within 5 miles of him was enough to keep the beast at bay. "Everything breaks when I exist," Nara had whispered to herself in the woods, a mantra of trauma that Kael could practically hear across the distance. He could picture her huddled in some hollow log, blaming her own soul for the death of the men who had banished her. She was a weapon of peace, who thought she was a harbinger of doom. Kael stood up, the chair screeching against the floor, and the room went silent. His presence didn't radiate terror today. It radiated a focused, lethal intent that made the other alphas bow their heads instinctively. "Prepare a retrieval team," he commanded, his voice echoing with a new, terrifying authority. He wasn't going to capture a fugitive for the Ironfang. He was going to secure the only thing in the world that kept him from becoming a monster. If the Ironfang wanted their anchor back, they would have to crawl through the wreckage of their own making to reach him. Chapter 6. The Blood and the Bond. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a hunting ground, and Nara was the prize. Kael tracked the scent of copper and wood smoke, his senses dialed to a pitch so sharp it bordered on agony. He found her at the base of a jagged cliff surrounded by 5 rogue hunters whose eyes glowed with the sickly yellow light of the feral. They weren't looking for a mate. They were looking for a meal and a bounty. Nara was backed against the stone, a small, jagged rock gripped in her trembling hand, her face a mask of quiet, resigned acceptance. She didn't scream when the largest rogue lunged. She simply closed her eyes, waiting for the end she believed she deserved. Kael didn't shift. He didn't need to. He hit the circle of rogues like a falling star, his movements a blur of calculated high-speed violence. He caught the first rogue's throat in his hand, the sound of snapping bone a sharp punctuation in the quiet woods. He moved with a grace that was purely lethal, a dancer in a theater of blood. Every time his skin brushed against the air near Nara, a jolt of pure, stabilizing energy surged through him, making his strikes faster and his vision clearer. He wasn't just fighting for her life. He was fighting for the only version of himself that wasn't a nightmare. The rogues realized too late that they weren't hunting an Omega. They were trespassing in the shadow of a god. When the last of them slumped into the crimson snow, Kael turned to her, his chest heaving, his hands stained with the evidence of his devotion. "Don't touch me," she breathed, her voice a tiny, fractured thing that hurt worse than any claw. She looked at the bodies, then at him, her trauma response painting him as just another predator in a long line of men who wanted something from her. Kael ignored the warning, stepping into her space and wrapping his cloak around her shivering frame. The physical contact was an explosion of sensory data. Her warmth, her heartbeat, the way her small frame fit perfectly against the hard lines of his armor. He felt her stiffen, then slowly, agonizingly, she began to melt into him, her fingers clutching his tunic as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. Their lives were now inextricably intertwined, a bond forged in blood and validated by the sudden, terrifying silence of the woods. He knew then that the world would come for her, not because she was a cleaner, but because she was the light that kept the dark at door.
Chapter 7. The Iron Gates of Night. The Fortress of Nightfall. Dominion loomed out of the swirling mountain mist like a jagged crown of obsidian, its sharp spires piercing the belly of the heavy gray clouds. Nara felt the oppressive weight of the stone walls long before the massive iron gates groaned open to admit Kael's war party. She sat stiffly atop a mountain horse, her fingers numbly gripping the pommel, feeling the predatory gaze of 100 hidden eyes tracking her every breath. This was a place of iron and shadow, a stark contrast to the rustic, wooden halls of the Ironfang she had called home. Because she was an outsider, and an Omega, the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, communal snarl of rejection that made her want to curl into a ball. She was a speck of dust in a cathedral of monsters, a girl who had spent her life cleaning floors now entering the inner sanctum of the most feared pack in the Northern Territories. As they rode through the secondary courtyard, the whispers began to rise, sharp and jagged as the stones beneath the horses' hooves. Nara kept her chin tucked into the heavy fur of Kael's cloak, trying to ignore the way the female wolves of the Nightfall sneered at her tattered appearance. They smelled of expensive musk and fresh kills, while she smelled of old blood and the damp rot of the forest floor. "Is that the prize?" a tall, silver-haired she-wolf mocked, her voice carrying across the yard with the sting of a whip. Nara felt the familiar, cold, familiar prickle of shame crawling up her spine, a hyper-vigilant survival mode kicking in that made her map every exit and every potential weapon in her vicinity. She was a ghost in a den of lions, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that these wolves didn't want a savior. They wanted a target. Kael didn't say a word, but the moment he dismounted, the atmosphere in the courtyard shifted from mockery to a suffocating, heavy silence. He walked to Nara's side, his hand reaching up to steady her as she slid down from the saddle, and the possessiveness in his touch was like a physical brand. The sheer audacity of an alpha of his standing touching an Omega with such reverence sent a shockwave through the gathered crowd. Nara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, as she realized she had traded one prison for another. "Stay beside me," Kael murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor her soul to the earth. He didn't ask. He commanded. Yet the underlying current of desperation in his tone was a secret only she could hear. Why did he need her so badly when he had an entire army at his beck and call? The question hung in the air, unanswered and heavy, as he led her toward the dark maw of the Great Keep. Chapter 8. The Resonance of the Hearth. The internal architecture of the Nightfall Keep was a labyrinth of cold stone and flickering torches, but the room Kael led Nara to was draped in heavy dark velvet that dampened the sound of their footsteps. He didn't send her to the servants' quarters or the damp cellars she expected. He brought her to a chamber that shared a wall with his own. Nara stood in the center of the plush rug, her hands trembling as she looked at the silver basins and the bed piled high with silk. "I don't belong here," she whispered, the words catching in her throat like a jagged piece of glass. She waited for the punch, the laugh, or the order to start scrubbing, but it never came. Instead, Kael watched her with an intensity that made her skin feel like it was humming with a static charge. He was a man drowning in his own power, and for some reason, her proximity was the only thing keeping his head above water. The realization hit her like a physical blow later that evening when a group of high-ranking warriors burst into the hall, their eyes glowing with the amber light of near-feral agitation. They had been patrolling the cursed borders, and the madness of the land was beginning to fray their nerves. Nara, who was sitting quietly by the hearth, felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the center of the room. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her presence acting like a drop of ink in clear water. As she moved, the frantic pacing of the wolves slowed. The snarls died in their throats, replaced by a confused, weary peace that washed over them in visible waves. Nara watched in disturbed silence as a scarred lieutenant slumped into a chair, his breathing leveling out for the first time in hours. She was a stabilizer, a living tonic for the violent spirits of the Nightfall, and the horror of that truth began to settle in her marrow. "You see it now, don't you?" Kael's voice drifted from the shadows behind her, his shadow falling across her small frame. He stepped into the light, his face a mask of weary relief as he observed his calmed men. He didn't look at her as a woman. He looked at her as a miracle he was terrified to lose. Nara felt a wave of nausea roll through her because this was just another form of being useful. In the Ironfang, she was a mop. Here, she was a battery. The intimacy Kael insisted on, demanding she stay in his line of sight, requiring her presence at his table, wasn't born of love, but of a biological necessity that felt like a new kind of chain. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Kael reached out, his thumb brushing the sensitive skin of her wrist. A jolt of pure, white-hot energy sparked between them, a sizzle of power that made him gasp and Nara recoil. The bond was growing, but so was her fear that she would never be more than a tool to the men who claimed to protect her. Chapter 9. The Shadow in the Mirror. Fear shifted into a cold, sharpened anger by the end of the first week, especially after the first assassination attempt shattered the fragile peace of the keep. Nara had been walking through the garden, trailing her fingers over the frost-bitten roses when a crossbow bolt hissed through the air, missing her temple by a fraction of an inch. Kael had been there in a heartbeat, his claws unsheathed and his roar echoing off the mountain peaks. But the message was clear. Someone didn't want the Nightfall stabilized. Someone wanted Nara dead. And it wasn't because of what she did, but because of what she was. She spent the afternoon locked in her room, staring at her reflection in a silver mirror, searching for the girl she used to be. The girl who cleaned blood. The girl who was invisible. That girl was gone, replaced by a target painted in golden shadow. "Why is an Omega worth so much effort?" Nara asked Kael that night, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook beneath the table. They were alone in his private study, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and the heavy, musky aroma of his wolf. Kael looked up from his maps, his eyes dark with a hunger he couldn't quite hide. He didn't answer immediately, instead rising from his chair to pace the small space like a caged animal. He explained the politics of the North, how the other packs were falling to the madness, how the Ironfang was crumbling without her, and how the Nightfall was the only thing standing between order and total chaos. But he didn't tell her the most important thing. He didn't tell her that he was falling in love with the way she looked at the moon when she thought no one was watching. The stakes rose to a fever pitch when a messenger arrived at the gates bearing the severed head of a Nightfall scout. Attached to the poor man's brow was a parchment stamped with the seal of the Ironfang Council. They weren't just asking for her return. They were claiming she was stolen property, a vital resource that belonged to them by right of blood. Nara felt a cold, existential betrayal wash over her as she realized her former pack hadn't discarded her because she was worthless. They had exiled her to see if they could survive without her, and now that they were failing, they wanted their cleaner back to save them from their own arrogance. She wasn't a girl to them. She was a natural resource to be mined. Kael crumpled the parchment in his fist, his knuckles turning white as he looked at Nara with a terrifying, possessive fire. "They will have to burn the world to take you," he growled. And for the first time, Nara didn't know which prospect was more frightening, being hunted by her past or being owned by her future. Chapter 10. The Crucible of the Cold. The mountain air bit into Nara's skin like 1,000 tiny needles as she stood in the center of the training ring, her breath hitching in a series of white plumes. Kael stood opposite her, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the morning sun whole. He didn't carry a sword or a whip. He carried the heavy, suffocating weight of an alpha's expectation. Because he knew the world was coming for her, he had stripped away her fine silks and replaced them with boiled leather and iron-studded bracers. "Move," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that rumbled through the soles of her feet. Nara lunged, her movements clumsy and tentative, the trauma of 1,000 invisible years making her muscles lock in anticipation of a blow that never came. She was trying to learn the language of violence after a lifetime of being its silent recipient. Kael caught her wrist with a speed that made her heart bolt. But instead of the harsh jerk she expected, his grip was firm and strangely warm. He pulled her flush against his chest, his other hand splaying across the small of her back to adjust her stance. The forbidden intimacy of the moment sent a jolt of static electricity through Nara, a hope she tried to suppress with every fiber of her being. She could smell the crisp scent of snow on his skin and the deep, earthy musk of his wolf, a combination that made her head swim with a dangerous longing. "Your power isn't in your fists, Nara," he whispered against the shell of her ear, his breath hitching in a way that betrayed his own struggle for composure. "It is in your center. If you break there, the world breaks with you." He was teaching her to fight, but he was also tethering himself to her heartbeat, an attachment that felt more like a vow than a lesson. Despite the grueling pace of the training, Nara found herself watching Kael in the quiet moments when the sun dipped below the jagged peaks. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he looked at the maps of the encroaching Ironfang borders, and the way his eyes softened whenever she managed to parry a strike. Attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford, a golden trap designed to make the inevitable betrayal hurt more. Yet, as he guided her hand to the hilt of a training blade, his fingers lingering over hers, she felt the first stirrings of a terrifying possibility. Maybe she wasn't just a battery. Maybe the heat between them was more than biological static. As the first winter storm began to howl against the fortress walls, Nara realized that the most dangerous thing in the Nightfall Dominion wasn't the assassins. It was the heart she was beginning to find beneath her own ribs. Chapter 11. The Pulse of the World. The truth didn't come in a sudden revelation, but in a catastrophic moment of clarity during a late-night council meeting that Nara was forced to attend. The room was thick with the scent of agitated alphas and the metallic tang of spilled wine, the air vibrating with a discord that made Nara's teeth ache. As the arguments over resource allocation turned into snarled threats, Nara felt a sudden, violent surge of energy boiling up from the very floorboards. It wasn't her anger. It was the land's. She realized with a sickening lurch that she wasn't just stabilizing the wolves. She was stabilizing the pack energy itself, acting as a grounding wire for a power that would otherwise consume them. The Ironfang hadn't just used her to clean floors, they had used her existence to anchor their very reality. They knew, Nara breathed, the words cutting through the Alpha's shouting like a silver blade. The room went silent as she stood up, her small frame trembling with a sudden existential betrayal. She looked at Kael, searching his dark eyes for a denial that didn't come. Because he was an Alpha, he understood the mechanics of power better than anyone, and the guilt written in the tension of his shoulders told her everything. The Ironfang hadn't discarded her because she was a burden. They had knowingly sacrificed her to see if they could survive without her stabilizing resonance. They had experimented on her soul, treating her like a piece of equipment to be tested to the point of failure. The realization that she had been exploited from birth made the blood in her veins turn to ice. The game had changed in an instant, shifting from a rescue mission to a political chess match of global proportions. Nara wasn't a girl caught between two alphas. She was the axis upon which the Northern Territories turned. "I am not a thing," she hissed, her voice rising with a power she didn't recognize as her own. As she spoke, the torches in the room flared with a brilliant, blinding white light, responding to the turbulence of her emotions. The alphas recoiled, their predatory instincts screaming at the sudden display of raw, unchanneled authority. Love now felt like an impossibility, a lie fed to her to keep her compliant while they mapped the limits of her utility. She looked at Kael, the man who had promised her safety, and saw only another keeper. The bond that had felt like a lifeline now felt like a leash, and the silence that followed her outburst was the heaviest she had ever known. Chapter 12. The Ironfang Ultimatum. Morning brought a cold, gray light and a messenger bearing a final demand from the Ironfang territory. The scroll was stained with the blood of a Nightfall border guard, a brutal punctuation mark to a message that left no room for negotiation. They wanted Nara back by the next full moon, or they would launch a scorched earth campaign that would leave the northern valleys in ashes. Political war wasn't just a threat anymore. It was an approaching shadow that threatened to swallow every life Nara had grown to care for. She stood on the battlements, watching the distant smoke of Ironfang watchfires, her old abandonment trauma resurfacing with a vengeance that made it hard to breathe. They wanted their anchor back, and they didn't care how many bodies they piled up to get it. "I won't let them take you," Kael growled, appearing behind her like a dark omen. He reached for her hand, but Nara pulled away, her eyes hard and distant. Because she knew the truth of her power, his protection felt like a strategic move rather than a romantic gesture. Conflict was no longer local, it was global, and she was the trigger for a war that could end her world. She felt the weight of every life in the Nightfall Dominion pressing down on her shoulders, a burden that made the blood-stained floors of her childhood seem like a mercy. If she stayed, thousands would die for her. If she left, she would return to a life of hollow service, a ghost in a hall that had already tried to kill her. How do you choose between a prison of iron and a prison of gold? Suddenly, a sharp, agonizing pain lanced through Nara's chest, a resonance fracture that made her stumble against the cold stone. Miles away, the Ironfang Pack was beginning to ritualistically call to her, using the shards of her childhood blood to pull at the bond they had tried to sever. It was a psychic hook, a jagged reminder that they still held the keys to her history. Kael caught her before she hit the ground, his roar of defiance echoing off the mountain peaks, but Nara could barely hear him over the screaming in her own mind. The Ironfang weren't just coming for her body, they were coming for the very essence of her soul. As the sky turned a bruised purple, Nara realized that the time for hiding was over. The cleaner Omega was gone, and in her place was a woman who was finally beginning to understand that her survival was the greatest threat of all. Chapter 13. The Sovereign Choice. The wind atop the Nightfall battlements tasted of impending snow and old iron, but for the first time in her life, Nara didn't let the cold sink into her bones. Below her, the courtyard was a hive of frantic activity as warriors sharpened blades and packed leather satchels for a war she had inadvertently sparked. She watched Kael from a distance, his movements sharp and jagged as he barked orders to his lieutenants. Because the Ironfang ultimatum had stripped away the illusion of peace, the air between them had become a live wire, humming with a tension that made her skin itch. She could feel the pull of the old pack, that phantom tug on her soul that whispered of duty and the safety of the known. But she also felt the heat of the nightfall, a fire that promised to consume her just as readily. "You're planning to run." Kael's voice cut through the darkness, closer than she had expected. He didn't approach with the predatory grace of an alpha today. He moved like a man walking toward a cliff edge. Nara didn't turn around, her gaze fixed on the flickering watchfires of the Ironfang scouts on the horizon. She had spent a lifetime being moved like a pawn on a scarred wooden board, her value calculated by men who never bothered to learn her name. Now, the choice was a jagged blade in her hand, and she was terrified of cutting herself on the edge of her own agency. If she stayed, she was choosing a side in a war that would paint the snow red. If she left, she was abandoning the only man who had ever looked at her and seen a person instead of a tool. Suddenly, Nara turned, her eyes clashing with his in the dim moonlight. "I am staying," she said, the words falling like heavy stones into a deep well. It was her first self-driven decision, a declaration that felt like tearing a ligament from a bone. She wasn't staying because of the bond, and she wasn't staying because of the silks or the silver basins. She was staying because, for the first time, she wanted to see the end of a story she was actually writing. Kael froze, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss of disbelief. The impact of her choice rippled through their connection, a surge of pure, unadulterated will that made the torches along the wall flare with a sudden, brilliant intensity. She was risking heartbreak knowingly, stepping into the path of a storm because she refused to be blown away by it anymore. Chapter 14. The Fragile Claim. The atmosphere inside the Alpha's private sanctum was thick with the scent of sandalwood and the heavy electric charge of a storm about to break. Nara sat on the edge of the massive fur-covered bed, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the bedpost as Kael paced the room. The transition from protector to partner was a minefield of unspoken desires and terrifying vulnerabilities. Because she had chosen him, the wall between them had thinned to a translucent membrane, allowing her to feel the raw, jagged edges of his dependence. He wasn't just an alpha anymore. He was a man who was terrified of the power she held over his very sanity. Romantic breakthrough felt less like a sunset and more like a surrender. "I can't breathe when you're not in the room," Kael confessed, stopping in front of her, his hands trembling as he reached out to cup her face. His voice was a broken rasp, stripped of the command that usually defined him. The madness. "It's not just the curse, Nara. It's the thought of you being back in that hall, scrubbing their floors while the world rots." He knelt before her, a king lowering himself to the dirt, and the sight of his vulnerability made Nara's breath hitch in her throat. This was the near claiming, a moment where their souls were hovering on the brink of a permanent, soul-deep fusion. She felt the heat of his skin through her tunic, a sizzling physical romance that threatened to melt the last of her defenses. However, as his lips brushed against the pulse point at her neck, a wave of old fear washed over her. Love leaves. That was the only lesson she had ever truly mastered. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his for the lie she was certain was hidden there. "You need me to be sane," she whispered, her voice a fractured thing. "But do you want me when the world is quiet?" The question hung in the air, a jagged hook that Kael couldn't immediately answer. The intimacy between them was a terrifying paradox, a bond that offered everything while threatening to erase her identity entirely. As the moon reached its zenith, Kael pulled her back into his arms, his touch a desperate plea for a future neither of them knew how to build. The love deepens, but so does the shadow of the coming summit. Chapter 15. The Summit of Shadows. The public Alpha Summit was held in the neutral glade, a place where the ancient trees were supposedly bound by oaths of peace, but the air felt like a bared throat. Nara stood at Kael's side, draped in heavy furs and silver chains that felt more like shackles than jewelry. The leaders of a dozen packs had gathered, their eyes narrow and calculating as they watched the cleaner Omega, who had brought the North to the brink of collapse. Because the Ironfang had leaked the truth of her resonance power, she was no longer a person to the men in the circle. She was a prize to be auctioned or a threat to be neutralized. She felt objectified again, a specimen under a microscope, and the familiar urge to take up less space began to gnaw at her. "She is a freak of nature!" the Ironfang Alpha roared, his voice echoing through the glade like a thunderclap. He stepped forward, his eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light as he gestured toward Nara. "She was born to serve the Ironfang, to anchor our bloodline. Kael has stolen the very heart of our territory." The accusation sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd, and Nara felt the eyes of every warrior present boring into her skin. They didn't see the girl who liked the smell of rain, or the woman who had chosen to stay. They saw a battery, a stabilizing force that could make their packs invincible. The personal stakes peaked as the Ironfang Alpha produced a vial of her childhood blood, holding it aloft like a holy relic. Suddenly, a wave of unnatural pressure settled over the glade, a psychic weight that made the younger wolves drop to their knees. The enemies were exposing her power publicly, forcing her to react, to show the world exactly what she was capable of. Nara felt the resonance boiling in her blood, a white-hot sun trapped behind her ribs, and for a moment she wanted to let it out, to burn the glade and the alphas and the silver chains to ash. Kael stepped in front of her, his own power clashing against the Ironfangs, but the damage was done. The secret was out, and the world now knew that the girl they had banished was the only reason any of them were still standing. As the summit dissolved into a cacophony of threats and snarls, Nara realized that the hunt had only just begun. Chapter 16. The Great Severing. The air in the High Council chamber was thick with the suffocating smell of cold ash and betrayal. Kael stood on the dais, his silhouette a jagged tear against the moonlight streaming through the narrow arrow slits of the fortress. Because the pressure from the United Northern Packs had reached a breaking point, the threat of a genocidal war against the Nightfall was no longer a shadow. It was a blade at their collective throat. Nara stood at the back of the room, her fingers digging into the stone molding of a pillar, her heart a frantic, dying bird. She watched the man she had begun to trust turn his gaze away from hers, his jaw set in a line of granite that brooked no argument. "She is nothing but a stray," Kael's voice rang out, a cold, hollow shell of the rumbling baritone that had whispered against her skin only nights before. He didn't look back as he addressed the assembly of hostile alphas, his words dripping with a calculated synthetic venom, a tool found in the woods, used for a season, and now discarded. The psychological devastation hit Nara harder than any physical blow she had ever endured in the Ironfang halls. Her childhood belief that love is a temporary ghost that leaves the moment you stop being convenient was confirmed with a clinical public precision. He was rejecting her to save her, to make the other packs believe she was worthless so they would stop hunting her, but the logic didn't reach the part of her that was currently shattering. Because the bond was a living thing, the public rejection felt like a hot iron being dragged across her soul. Nara felt the tether between them fray and snap, a spiritual amputation that left her gasping for air in the sudden, freezing silence of the room. She looked at the warriors who had once knelt to her, seeing only the reflection of her own perceived insignificance in their eyes. Kael had chosen the pack over the person, the kingdom over the girl, and in doing so, he had handed her back to the darkness she had spent her life trying to outrun. As she turned to flee the chamber, the heavy iron doors felt like the lid of a casket closing on the only version of herself she had ever liked. Chapter 17. The Echo of Madness. Isolation in the servants' wing felt like a slow-motion drowning, the luxury of her former chambers replaced by a damp, narrow cell that smelled of mildew and forgotten things. Nara sat on the stone floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, feeling the bond fracture weakening her physical form. Without the constant, grounding connection to Kael, her resonance power began to leak from her pores like radioactive light. making the shadows in the room dance with a sickly, erratic energy. She was a reactor without a cooling system, and the internal pressure was beginning to crack her ribs from the inside out. Every breath was a labor of grief, a reminder that she had allowed herself to hope in a world built on teeth and claws. Meanwhile, in the Alpha's tower, the consequence of the severing was manifesting in a far more violent fashion. Kael had descended into a state of semi-permanent madness, his beast clawing at the walls of his mind now that its anchor was gone. He had tried to protect her by pushing her away, but he had underestimated the way their souls had already fused into a single, functioning unit. His roars echoed through the keep at night, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that made even the bravest Nightfall warriors tremble in their beds. He was losing everything, his command, his sanity, and the very girl he had set on fire to save. The strategy of rejection was failing because a soul cannot be tricked by a lie told for its own benefit. "Why do I still care?" Nara whispered to the cold stones, her voice a fractured rasp. She could hear Kael's rage through the walls, a rhythmic thudding of a body throwing itself against the constraints of reality. Both had lost everything in the pursuit of a safety that didn't exist. The pack was in chaos, the borders were failing, and the girl who stabilized the world was currently wilting like a flower in a vacuum. She realized then that the bond wasn't just a gift, it was a life support system that they had both unplugged in a moment of desperate, misguided sacrifice. As the first frost of a true winter began to crystallize on the window bars, Nara felt the last flicker of her self-worth start to dim into a gray, lifeless ash. Chapter 18. The Acceptance of the Void. All was lost by the time the moon reached its perigee, a bloated, sickly silver orb that seemed to mock the carnage below. Nara stood by the window of her cell, watching the distant flickers of Ironfang torches drawing closer to the Nightfall gates. The war was coming anyway, regardless of Kael's lies or her own exile within the fortress walls. She realized a truth in that quiet, desperate hour that she hadn't been ready to face before. She had abandoned herself long before the Ironfang banished her or Kael rejected her. She had spent her entire life looking for a mirror that didn't show a servant, never realizing that she was the one holding the glass. The quiet acceptance that washed over her wasn't a peaceful thing. It was the cold, heavy stillness of a graveyard. She didn't fear the Ironfang anymore, and she didn't fear the madness that was currently consuming Kael in the tower above. She simply felt finished. The resonance power within her had gone from a boiling sun to a cold, black hole, a gravity that threatened to pull the entire mountain into its center. She was the reason the world stayed upright, and she was tired of holding up the sky for people who only looked at her to see if she was holding a mop. The battle was beginning at the gates, the sound of splintering wood and clashing steel rising like a prayer for a god that wasn't listening. How many times can a heart break before it turns into a stone? Nara watched a single snowflake drift through the bars, landing on her pale, scarred hand. She didn't brush it away. She didn't move as the first screams of the dying drifted up from the courtyard. The battle had begun without hope, a desperate clash of fading empires and broken men. Kael was a monster in the tower, she was a ghost in the cellar, and the Ironfang were wolves at the door. As the foundation of the keep began to shudder under the weight of the encroaching army, Nara closed her eyes and let the darkness finally take the lead. The cleaner was gone, the anchor was broken, and the world was finally going to feel what it was like to be truly, utterly alone. Chapter 19. The Altar of the Self. The stone walls of the cell didn't just feel cold anymore. They felt transparent, as if the physical world was losing its grip on Nara's increasingly volatile essence. Outside, the cacophony of the siege was a dull roar, the sound of the Ironfang Pack tearing at the throat of the Nightfall Dominion. Because she had been hollowed out by Kael's rejection, Nara sat in the center of the dark room, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. She waited for the traditional surge of fear, the old instinct to hide or to find a master to shield her, but the silence inside her own mind was deafening. The vacuum left by the shattered bond had created a space where the voices of others, The insults of the elders, the demands of the alphas finally ceased to echo. Suddenly, a realization sparked in the center of her chest, not as a bolt of lightning, but as a slow, steady warmth. Her power had never actually belonged to the packs, and it certainly hadn't belonged to Kael. It was a part of her marrow, as intrinsic as the color of her eyes. She understood in that frozen moment that her value came from self-acceptance, not from the proximity of a crown or the utility of a rag. The resonance wasn't a curse designed to stabilize the violent. It was the song of her own soul, and she had been letting others hum the melody. She stood up, her legs shaky, but her gaze fixed on the heavy oak door. She wasn't an omega waiting for a savior. She was the architect of the very air they breathed. Reclaimed identity tasted like iron and honey, a potent combination that made the shadows in the room recoil from her. Nara reached out, her fingers brushing the rusted lock of her cell, and instead of struggling, she simply willed the molecules to move. The metal groaned and disintegrated into a fine, silver dust, yielding to a command that wasn't born of desperation, but of sovereignty. She stepped into the hallway, her tattered tunic shifting into a garment of woven light as her internal energy began to manifest. She was no longer a ghost haunting the corridors of a fortress. She was the fortress itself. As she walked toward the stairs leading to the battlements, the stone beneath her feet vibrated with a purr of recognition, welcoming the return of its true center. Chapter 20. The Choice of the Unsummoned. The battlefield was a vision of hell, a churning sea of fur, steel, and crimson snow that stretched from the fortress gates to the edge of the dark forest. Nara stood on the highest parapet, the wind whipping her hair into a frantic halo of black silk. She looked down at the carnage, seeing the Ironfang warriors she had once feared, and the Nightfall soldiers she had once served. None of them had summoned her. Kael was a screaming shadow in the courtyard below, lost to a madness so profound he was killing friend and foe alike, his beast a mindless engine of destruction. Because she was no longer bound by his command or their need, Nara had every reason to turn her back on the slaughter and vanish into the mountains. However, she didn't turn away. She stepped off the edge of the stone battlement, not falling, but descending through the air as if the wind itself were a staircase built for her feet. Nara returned to the battlefield by choice, a voluntary act of grace that shattered the ancient laws of shifter hierarchy. She wasn't a resource being retrieved. She was a goddess descending into the pit. The warriors near the gate froze, their weapons lowering as a wave of unnatural, cooling peace began to radiate from her small, luminous figure. She walked through the thick of the fighting, the mud and blood parting before her like the Red Sea. Why save a world that had only ever tried to break her? Because she was the only one who could, and she was done letting their cruelty define her mercy. Transformation was complete the moment her bare feet touched the blood-soaked earth of the courtyard. The wolves of the Ironfang, seeing their stolen prize walking toward them with the authority of a star, dropped to their haunches in a primal, involuntary display of submission. They didn't see a cleaner. They saw the apex of their entire species. Nara ignored them, her eyes fixed on the massive, charcoal-furred wolf that was currently tearing through a line of Nightfall defenders. Kael was a nightmare of teeth and gore, his eyes vacant of any human thought. She didn't call to him with a plea. She called to him with a demand, her voice ringing out over the screams of the dying like a bell in a storm. The battle for the North was no longer about territory. It was about whether a monster could be reminded of his soul. Chapter 21. The Reignited Thread. Nara stood directly in the path of the raging Alpha, her arms open, her chest bared to the claws that had already ended a dozen lives that morning. Kael lunged, a roar of pure, incoherent fury ripping from his throat, his massive jaws snapping inches from her throat. He was a hurricane of muscle and madness, a creature who had forgotten the taste of light. Nara didn't flinch, and she didn't use her power to strike him down. She chose him again, despite the rejection, despite the lies, and despite the cold cell he had left her in. She reached out, her small hands sinking into the thick, matted fur of his neck, and pulled his massive head toward her heart. The bond reignited with the force of a supernova, a blinding white bridge of energy that connected their souls across the abyss of his insanity. A jolt of pure resonance flooded Kael's system, scouring the madness from his mind like a forest fire clearing out the underbrush. He collapsed into the mud at her feet, his form shifting and shimmering as he struggled to return to his human shape. Nara held him, her light wrapping around his broken spirit like a shroud of silk. She felt his heart begin to beat in synchronization with hers, a rhythmic thud that signaled the return of the man she had allowed herself to love. The wolves surrounding them watched in a stunned, religious silence as the greatest alpha in the north wept against the knees of a girl they had called a slave. "I am here," Nara whispered, her voice carrying to the furthest edges of the battlefield. The hook was set, not by fate, but by her own hand. The Ironfang Alpha tried to move forward, his hand reaching for his sword, but the ground beneath him cracked with a warning tremor that sent him stumbling back. The power she unleashed was no longer a stabilizing anchor. It was a sovereign shield. She looked up at the circle of enemies and allies, her eyes glowing with a quiet, terrifying clarity. The war wasn't over, but the hierarchy was dead. As she stood over the recovering Kael, Nara realized that she had finally found the answer to her own question. Love wasn't something you earned by being useful. It was something you commanded by being whole. Chapter 22. The Resonance of a Queen. The battlefield of the Nightfall courtyard was no longer a place of chaotic slaughter, but a silent theater of the impossible. Nara stood in the center of the carnage, her feet rooted in the blood-stained earth, while her internal energy spiraled upward like a pillar of fire. Kael lay at her feet, his human form shivering as the last of the madness was purged from his marrow by the sheer force of her touch. Because the Ironfang Alpha saw his leverage slipping away, he lunged forward, his face contorted into a mask of desperate greed. He didn't see a woman. He saw the battery that belonged in his hall, the engine of his pack's survival. He swung his silver-edged claymore in a wide, lethal arc, aiming to reclaim by force what he had lost through arrogance. Nara didn't move a muscle, but the air around her thickened until it was as dense as armor. When the blade struck the invisible perimeter of her resonance, it didn't shatter. It simply ceased to exist, turning into a cloud of harmless metallic butterflies that drifted away on the wind. She unleashed her full power then, a psychic shockwave that rippled out from her heart and across the entire valley. It wasn't a pulse of violence, but a wave of absolute, terrifying stability. Every wolf on the field, from the lowliest Ironfang scout to the highest Nightfall commander, felt their internal beasts forced into a state of total, involuntary peace. The aggression that had fueled the war was extinguished in a heartbeat, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a physical weight. The climax reached its peak as the Ironfang Alpha dropped to his knees, not out of respect, but because the very gravity of the area had acknowledged its true master. Nara looked down at him, her eyes burning with the cold light of 1,000 stars. "You banished the reason you survived," she said, her voice echoing in the minds of every living thing for miles. "Now, you will survive only if I allow it." Kael, finally finding his strength, rose beside her, but he didn't stand over her or in front of her. He knelt publicly, bowing his head to the woman he had tried to push away, surrendering his crown to the anchor of his soul. Love chosen freely had finally answered the question of her worth, and the answer was a roar that shook the mountains. Chapter 23. The New Architecture of Power. The falling action of the war was as swift as it was transformative, as the old hierarchies of the shifter world crumbled like sun-dried parchment. In the weeks that followed the Battle of the Nightfall, the traditional pack structures began to reorganize around a new center of gravity. Nara didn't return to the shadows or the servant's wing. She moved into the High Council chamber, replacing the maps of war with blueprints for a unified territory. Because her resonance power now acted as a permanent bridge between the rival packs, The constant low-level friction of wolf territory disputes vanished. The world was no longer built on the fear of the Alpha, but on the stability of the Omega who had outgrown her chains. Omega status was challenged and dismantled across the northern reaches, as Nara issued decrees that recognized the inherent value of every pack member, regardless of their rank or utility. The young wolves of the Ironfang, who had been taught to view themselves as disposable tools, looked toward the nightfall with a hope that had been extinct for generations. Nara watched from the battlements as the first integrated patrols crossed the borders, their scents mingling in a way that would have meant certain death only months prior. The political war was over, replaced by a delicate, budding era of cooperation that was held together by the sheer force of Nara's will. She wasn't just a partner anymore, she was the architect of a new civilization. Personal peace, however, was a slower victory to claim. Nara and Kael walked through the forest one evening, the air thick with the scent of spring's first thaw. The tension of the near claiming had matured into a deep, resonant intimacy that didn't require the frantic energy of a crisis to sustain it. "I thought I was saving you by letting you go," Kael admitted, his hand entwined with hers, his thumb tracing the scars on her knuckles. Nara stopped, looking at the man who had seen her as a ghost and stayed to witness her become a queen. She realized then that the bond hadn't been a trap and it hadn't been a leash. It had been a mirror, waiting for her to be brave enough to look into it. Resolution was a quiet meal in a hall that no longer smelled of blood, but of wood smoke and the laughter of a pack that was finally whole. Chapter 24. The Epilogue of Light. Months later, the territories surrounding the Nightfall Dominion had become a sanctuary that the rest of the world whispered about in tones of awe. Young wolves from every corner of the continent thrived peacefully in the glades near Nara's presence, their playfighting devoid of the jagged edge of trauma that usually defined shifter childhoods. The metallic tang of blood that had once defined Nara's existence was a distant memory, replaced by the scent of pine, honey, and the clean, cold air of the high peaks. She sat on a bench in the courtyard where she had once scrubbed stones, watching a group of Omega children learn the art of strategy from a Nightfall general. They didn't have to hide, and they didn't have to be useful to be safe. A traveler from the south, a man who had only ever known the brutal laws of the old packs, stopped at the gates and looked around in confusion. He saw the Alphas kneeling to play with pups and the Omegas leading the council sessions with voices that didn't tremble. "Why do the wars never reach this territory?" he asked a passing guard, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword he didn't realize he wouldn't need. The guard smiled, a genuine expression of peace that the traveler had never seen on a shifter's face before. He pointed toward the high balcony where a woman stood with a dark-haired man at her side, their silhouettes framed by the setting sun. "Because she's home," Kael answered quietly from the balcony, though his voice seemed to carry through the very air the traveler breathed. He leaned in, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to the crown of Nara's head, his hand resting protectively on her waist. Nara leaned back into him, her eyes closing as she felt the pulse of the land vibrating in perfect harmony with her own heart. She was no longer the girl they banished, and she was no longer the cleaner who erased the messes of men. She was the resonance, the light, and the law. Peace had finally replaced survival, and as the moon rose over a world that was no longer broken, Nara realized that the only love worth having was the kind that didn't need a reason to exist.